I am sorry that I'm not able to join you in London, but alas, the circumstances of life prevent that. And when I wrote to withdraw from the conference, not only did the team not accept my withdrawal, but they gave me the role of keynote speaker. So as my mother would have said, which roughly translates from the frying pan into the fire. So here goes. Let me start with a data point that you should keep in mind. 2 years ago, when ChatGPT kind of was in the news all over the place, I attempted to exercise my exploration of the engine, and I put in a question: write a 500-word essay on Nizari Ismailism. The result I got was 64 words, and 2 out of the 3 sentences were erroneous and false. So please keep that in mind. I'll try and come back to this. And I have been warned by Dr. Mohammadpour that I have to stick to my time. So I want to, in case the clock runs out, this is something that I do all the time, I want to give you the key points that I'm hoping to speak to you about. One is our sources and the optiques determine our understandings. And this has changed over the last century and a half in a dramatic way, and I hope that it will continue. The second thing is we need to shift from the understandings of the Nizaris as in conflict with the Seljuks, with the Mongols, and so forth. We need to shift from the paradigm of conflict to think about the confessional fluidities and engagement of the peoples. To that effect, I hope that we will try and abandon Vladimir Ivanov's periodization to a certain extent, and so similarly Marshall Hodgson's periodization, that Alamut period limits to one fortress, a fortress, and diminishes the role of other locations, that the Nizari Ismaili endeavor was a multi-local endeavor within Iran, in the other areas of where the Nizaris existed, in Syria, in India as well. The second thing, I think I'm coming on the tail of what Dr. Mohammadpour was talking about, that we need to focus on narrative. Narrative in the humanities is how did or how do our fellow human beings explain their pasts and presents? And it's important to understand why. Seeking to validate our mutable truths is just that, validating our truths, and it's an end of the discussion. So I hope that we will focus more on the narratives, both in doctrinal literature as well as historiography. And linked to this, if you read the vast amounts of history and theology that is written in the Islamicate context, but beyond the Islamicate context, it is always done from top down. It's the elites that are written about, because the writing is done by these elites. I think we ought to at least listen carefully, and even if we can, to give voice to the silent and the silenced. Lastly, I want to suggest that we ought to be expanding our spaces for discussion, and we ought to allow for greater scholarship in our field. And that means that adopting technology and creating perhaps an LLM of scholarship on Shiism, on Ismailism, on Nizari Ismailism, and generally Islam. Lastly, I want to say that if I can do this, so can you, especially to those young scholars who might be in the room or who might be watching this from on Zoom. That I started my career academic career in my late 30s, and Arabic and Persian were perhaps my 10th and 11th languages. And having had concussions in my childhood, dealing with history is a challenge and a joy. So let me turn to this presentation. I want to dedicate this talk to the memories of Vladimir Ivanov and Marshall Hodgson. Marshall Hodgson called Vladimir Ivanov the founder of the field of Ismaili studies. And Marshall Hodgson is a towering giant. He's known for the venture of Islam, which is one of the most important and influential texts in Islamic studies. But I think as a scholar, my undergraduate and graduate students could do without looking at the venture of Islam. But anybody working on Ismaili studies, especially Nizari Ismaili studies, cannot do without looking at Marshall Hodgson's Order of the Assassins and his other writings. I also want to dedicate this talk to the scholarship of Farhad Daftari and Syed Jalal Badakhshani. Farhad Daftari, as all of us know, has contributed a lifetime of writing and thinking, and many of our books aligned, our shelves aligned with his books. And Jalal Badakhshani's impact is as deep and vast as Vladimir Ivanov's, in that he has provided us with many texts from the early Nizari period that are valuable and invaluable to our studies. We are, the Nizari Ismaili community is going through a process of transition. I just wanted to reflect and just say three things about the 49th Imam. Shah Karim had a vision. He had a vision, I think, that was so vast that no other religious leader has compares. In the 1960s, early 70s, he challenged his followers to think about what their religiosity would be like when they traveled to the moon or Mars. In an interview to Pakistan TV in 1985, he said, "The eternal values of Islam are such that whether a man lived 100 years ago or lives 100 years from now, he's always in his correct position. There is no conflict. So in terms of the humanistic, permanent values of faith, I would say that obviously Islam puts an individual in a very privileged position." And the last comment that I want to make is, he was an architect at heart. He built many buildings. And I have it on a very short chain of isnads, and this akhbar comes through several directions, is that there is an instance where he was looking at one of the models of the buildings that he was initiating. And he was on his knees while his leaders were standing around him uncomfortably. And he says to them, "You have to look at it from the man on the street's view." And I want to suggest that he has thought about that building standing 1,000 years and has viewed it from the view of that man and woman in the street 1,000 years from hence. This is clearly somebody who can be counted as Azim al-Insan, and I want to commemorate the blessed memory of the 49th Imam. Let me turn to what we are discussing here. Sources and their interpretations impact how we look at the past and perhaps also the present. The Nizari polity extends from 1090 to 1256-57. As you see, I'm using the term Nizari polity, not state. I'm using a periodization of realm of the Dais and realm of the Imams. And in this period, 1095, the Imam Caliph Nizar dies in Cairo, is killed in Cairo, and then we have a period of Satr. This is very interesting, a very interesting issue for us to consider in this conference and perhaps in our work. What does Satr mean? Concealment. Here, the communities in Alamut, in other places, are manifest. They're not concealed. Here, the Dawah is manifest across the Persianate lands into Asia and into Syria, into South Asia and into Syria. The Imam is concealed. And then on the 15th of August, and I'm using the conversion into the Gregorian calendar rather than the redundant approach of converting into the Julian calendar and then into the Gregorian calendar that we use. So on the 15th of August, the Qiyāmat-e-Buzurg that all my colleagues today are going to speak about. That is the Kashf, the manifestation of the Imamate. And in the reign of Jalaluddin Hasan, 2 generations after the declaration of the Qiyāma, there is another period of Satr. Not the same as the period of Satr from the death of Imam Jafar Sadiq to the foundation of the Fatimid Empire. Not the same Satr from the death of Nizar to the Qiyāma. But here, in this period of Satr, the teachings of the Qiyāma are concealed. And then scholars such as Nasruddin Tusi write and work towards the reintroduction of the teachings of the Qiyāma. And in 1256, under Hulagu, the grandson of Genghis Khan, the Mongols come and decapitate the Nizari polity. And in this time, this period, we're dealing with a bookending of the Seljuk invasion, nomadic Seljuks from Central Asia, Turks from Central Asia, and on the other end, nomadic Mongols from Central Asia sweeping into Iran and the Western Islamicate lands. And also, as the Seljuks decline, the Khwarazm Shahs are in power. So these are the cognate and adjacent areas of studies in which Nizari Ismaili, the development and emergence of Nizari Ismailism becomes very important. A Mongol minister, Ata Malik Juvaini, tells us that he went into the library. He got permission from Hulagu to enter the library, and he took out the Quran, various scientific pieces of equipment, and the Sarguzasht, the Sayyidina, the biography of Ḥasan-i Ṣabbāḥ. We have 3 chronicles, so, 2 more after Juvaini's Tariq-e-Jahangir Shah, the history of the world conqueror, and then Rashiduddin Fazlullah, the Wazir, writes in 1314 the account of the Fatimids and the Nizaris, and similarly Kashani writes the Zubdat Tawarik in 1316. These 2 later authors had access to Nizari witnesses, perhaps. They had access to the Nizari sources that Juvaini acquired from Alamut, and perchance, perhaps, they also had access to other sources that may have come from other fortresses that were, whose libraries were not destroyed, or from other Nizari Ismaili sources. So this is the beginnings of the writings about the Nizari Ismailis. And what I want to make a point of is that they're using Nizari Dawa literature to write historical chronicles, dynastic histories of the Fatimids and the Nizaris. And here I have mapped the blue line is a marker of the length of the rule of each one of the dinas at Alamut, and then we have word lengths dedicated to each one of the rulers. And the period that we're looking at, there is a significant amount of writing, because they're construing the declaration of the Qiyāma as an aberration. They're construing the declaration of the Qiyāma as antinomian. But if you note, the major writings that we have surviving about the qiyāma from within the Dawa literature, the Haft Bab, the Diwan-e-Qaimiyat, the Rawdat-e-Taslim, and Sayr Saluk, etc., etc. These are done in periods after the qiyāma was enacted. So the question is, what was the qiyāma? Is it something that was theologized and developed and written about in times afterwards? I want to show you a genealogy of texts which results in how the information about the Nizari polity percolates through in time. So Juvaini had access to the library at Alamut. Rashiduddin also had access to the library, materials from the library, and perhaps more. Rashiduddin was born in a Nizari fortress. His family had been given refuge by the Ismailis. And when Hulagu's armies pulled up, Rashiduddin's family, along with Nasiruddin Tusi and others, marched out of the Ismaili fortress and into the service of the Mongols. So these two texts became paradigms, but then there are some further paradigms that develop for the historic understanding of the Nizari polity. And Hamdullah Mastawfi Qazwini's writing becomes one such paradigm, and he influences the 15th and 16th century authors, Mir Khan and Khandamir, who are writing in Eastern Iran, Western Afghanistan of today. So let me just give you a quick scan of how these things matter. So the translation that Dr. Muhammadpur has done of Shahrastani gave us in his Kitab Milal wa Nihal perhaps the earliest understanding of the theology related to Ḥasan-i Ṣabbāḥ and the Nizari Ismailis as they emerged. He gives us this notion that they're the Talimiyya, and something that I question, but he labeled the Nizari venture as the new Dawah. Benjamin of Tudela, traveling through this region in the 1160s, reports that there were 4 Jewish villages allied with the Nizaris. We have an anonymous text, the Bahr al-Fawaid, which gives us very interesting information about Ḥasan-i Ṣabbāḥ and his activities, but is frothing at the mouth, anti-Ismaili, anti-Shi in many effects, and just like Ibn Jawzi's writing, makes the blood of the Ismailis licit. And then we have a very interesting text completed around 1167, written in Mia Farrakhan, which is present-day Van, Lake Van region in Anatolia in Turkey. This chronicle has very interesting information about Nas and records a genealogy of imams descended from Nizar bin al-Mustansir. And I believe Khalil Andani is going to be speaking about this text, so I'll let him expound on that and move on. Then we have a couple of chronicles coming from, a couple of accounts coming from Juzjani, the Tabakat-e-Nasiri, and Nasawi's biography of Jalaluddin Mankubardi, the last of the Khwarazm Shahs. These are 2 people who had direct contact as traders, as diplomats with the Nizari Ismailis. And they had traveled to Nizari territories after the qiyāma. And yet in their writing, while they cast the Ismailis as mulhids, as heretics, there is no indication, no mention of the qiyāma. We have in Mir Khan, in Mir Khan, we have a source that is used by modern historians. So von Hammer-Purgstall uses Mir Khan's Rawzat al-Safa as his main source of history, and his anti-Shi, anti-Ismaili perspectives are carried through. The Fremery similarly uses the Tariq Guzida of Qazvini, again a very anti-Ismaili text. And just so that you know, there is a long and lasting impact of this historiography. The anonymous Dabistan Mazahib was a source for Sir Joseph Arnold in his judgment of the Aga Khan case. I want to suggest that there are three phases in Nizari Ismaili studies. The first is the modern Nizari Ismaili studies. The first is where the sources are such as that of Mir Khan and Kandamir and Qazvini and Juvaini. These are highly anti-Ismaili, anti-Nizari texts. And from the 18th century, late 18th century, early 19th century, and into the 20th century, these were the main sources that were used by scholars, Western European scholars, who then construed the Nizaris as an extreme Shi heresy, and that the Nizaris sought to destroy Islam from within. A second phase of Ismaili studies, Nizari Ismaili studies, begins with Vladimir Ivanov. From his time in India in the 1930s onwards, he brings to publication multiple Ismaili texts, which Nizari Ismaili texts, which give a different understanding. And we have a stream of scholarship into our present times. Some scholars who might even be in the room I have listed in this phase. And the construal is that the Nizaris are a community amongst the Muslims. Yes, battling against their enemies and developing their idiosyncratic doctrines. The third phase, I believe, is something that we need to enter into. And in this phase, I think we have to ask new questions from the same three chronicles that had access to the Nizari materials from Alamut and elsewhere. And we have to then, in addition to looking at the histories of the imams, dais, and elites, we have to at least listen for and retrieve the diverse voices of the masses, give them agency. They were silent and they were silenced. The other effort I think we need to do is we need to place the development, doctrinal development, in the wider plane of Islamicate historical and religious discourses. What was happening at Alamut during the qiyāma is not a unique phenomenon. The task that I was given was to talk about the state of the field. So how would we examine the state of the field? We have a couple of artifacts that I can put in front of you. At the University of Chicago, in the archives, there's communication between Marshall Hodgson and Vladimir Ivanov. Here's a reply to a letter from March of 1949 by Ivanov to Marshall Hodgson. He says, "I do not know anyone anywhere except myself who is interested and is doing some work on Nizari Ismailis, especially of the Alamut period." And he states that there is not much about the Syrian Ismailis, and that he was going to write about them, and that there are very few manuscripts available. He has the Radat al-Taslim, the Shihaf al-Nazarin, and several others. And that the Alamut period is a period where there is very little reliable material. And he tells Hodgson, and some of us, if we had this kind of advice, might have steered clear, but Hodgson persevered. He says, "If you're a beginner, I would decidedly advise you to shift to an easier accessible period, so that working over it, you could do the work as well as accumulate knowledge for further studies if you intend to continue. In a subsequent letter, he advises not to rely on Shahrastani. He says to Hodgson that your decision of waiting until the Rawdat al-Taslim becomes available is quite sound. And then he goes on to say, I hope you'll excuse me for saying frankly, the mentality of your professors who have accepted a subject such as this for your doctorate thesis is beyond comprehension to me. Suffice it to say that the relationship between the two declined within a year, and they were slinging mud at each other indirectly in their work. Ivanov, meanwhile, put out several texts from the early Nizari and later Nizari periods, and this became indispensable for scholars in the field. And then the chronicles were published. Giovanni, the text was edited in I'm sorry, I'm hearing.
Shiraz, you've got a couple of minutes only 2 minutes. You have to wrap it up.
Okay. So I'm going to jump through my presentation here because I've been given the warning of time, and let me go and show you a couple of the many slides that I have prepared for this. The output of the work that Ivanov began results in this type of work. And I want to show you just by titles how there has been a change in the field. If you look at these major histories that were written from 1955 onwards, Hodgson's dissertation published in 1955, the title says Struggle Against the World, the Islamic World. Ivanov talks about strongholds. Lewis talks about a radical sect. But then there's a change. Daftari starts to clear up the myths. And then Nadia Jamal and Shafiq Virani talk about survival, continuity, and salvation. What is the change? Why? Because Nizari materials have become available, and because Rashiduddin's chronicle has become available. Yesterday, for just to give us an idea of where we stand today, I searched the Harvard Library's catalog for the terms Nizari and Ismaili, and 72 books showed up. When you add Alamut, there are 19 books in the collection. If you go to JSTOR, the database, and look up book chapters, there are 203 book chapters on the Nizari Ismailis. And if you add Alamut, that's 62 chapters. And similarly with the articles. An interesting statistic here is if you look at PhD dissertations, if you put in the search terms Nizari and Ismaili, there are 281 dissertations that reference Nizaris and Ismailis together. And if you boil it down to the abstracts, meaning the texts that are focused precisely on the early Nizari Ismailis, then there are some 12 dissertations. And several of these people are, here's a listing of about 19 of them, and several of these people are in the room in London, and I wish I was conversing with you all. The highlighted texts in yellow have been published, and the white ones remain to be published. So I have said this, but the changes are happening because of the greater availability of Dawah resources and who is doing Ismaili studies, because we're no longer just having Western European Christian scholars working on Ismaili studies, but we have Ismailis, we have Muslims who are trained in Western study of religion, and they're engaging in this process. The other major change that has happened is the establishment by His Highness Prince Karim Aga Khan in 1977 of the Institute of Ismaili Studies. This brings together a host of resources, of human resources, material resources, archival resources, which I believe are more and more being available. And in that paragraph, you read from Rashiduddin Fazlullah that the historian must look at the writings and the words of the people he studies rather than the diminishment and the demonization that is written about them. Perhaps 800 years later, we are paying attention to Rashiduddin's call. Here is a range of books that have come out, and most recently, my friend Miklos Sarkozy's book, which is telling us about the relationships between the Nizaris and their neighbors in the Caspian region. This is a huge number of books, but Azim Nanji, when speaking about the Ginans, had said, if you consider that every one of Shakespeare's plays has 200 books, this is but a meager collection of writings on early Nizari Ismailism, and we need to do more. One of the other indications of the state of the field is the number of bibliographies. In Ismaili studies, there are at least 8 to 10 bibliographies, the work of Ivanov, the work of Daftari, the work of Punawala.
Shiraz, your time is up. I'm afraid you
okay,
need to just wrap it on.
Let me just go to my last slide, and I'll close, last slide, and I'll close here. As you can see, the time allotted, 20 minutes for this gargantuan effort, is short. The time allotted for you for this conference, the time available for you for this conference is short, but I hope that you will have a productive conference, and I look forward to listening to your discussions. And I think we should hold Dr. Mohammadpour to the promise that this topic will be visited, revisited, and revisited again and again. As you are going through your discussions, I want you to think about that notion of satr that I described, that the idea of satr is different in different time periods. And then with the qiyāma, the imam becomes manifest. What does that mean? What does that satr and kashf mean in that context? And then Jalaluddin Hasan's imamate, during his imamate, when the imam is manifest, the dawah is manifest, the believers are manifest, but the doctrine of the qiyāma is in satr. What does that mean? And here are a couple of very deep theological thoughts for you to think about. If the Qaim's role is to perfect the imperfect creation, why does God need a human to perfect the creation? In the Zoroastrian tradition, the Sayashant; in the Judaic traditions, the Messiah; in the Christian tradition, the second coming of Christ; and in the Islamicate notions, the Mahdi al-Qaim, brings us to this moment of perfection when their arrival happens, and in their period, perfection takes place. The last thing that I urge you to think about is not just the theological writing and the writings of the elites that we have, but imagine what was the change, what was the difference in the lives of the Nizari Ismailis of the time. And I asked you at the outset of this presentation that to keep in mind that when I posed the question 500-word essay to AI, today, if you do that, you will get 500 words, pretty accurate in many ways, but yet simplistic. We are about 2 years away, a year and a half, 2 years away from where AI will be able to transcribe manuscripts, handwritten manuscripts. We are already at a stage where AI is able to translate from Persian, from Arabic, etc., etc. So those of you who are entering the field and those of you who are in the field, think about what is your value add when generative artificial intelligence is doing what philologists have been doing for the past 2 centuries. I think that has to be focus a focus on narrative. It has to be a focus on the average believers. And to this effect, I ask you to possibly consider thinking about creating an LLM. Let us collaborate on creating an LLM on Ismaili studies, on Shi'i studies, on Islamicate studies, inshallah. The last thing that I want to leave you with is this thought. We need to create more spaces to argue, to debate, to learn from each other, and still be friends. Just because you criticize me, I should not make you an enemy of God. With
Thank
that,
you very much, Shiraz. We need to really cut it off right now. We will run
I'm
through
just
for the rest
wishing
of the
you all the
panels.
best for today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.